You're driving home, nothing wrong, no violation, and suddenly lights flash behind you. The officer walks up and says 4 words that turn an innocent person into a suspect in less than a second. You match a description. And what almost everyone does next determines whether they walk away in 5 minutes or spend the next 6 hours proving they didn't do something they never did. Give me 15 minutes and I'll walk you through exactly what this phrase actually means legally, why it's one of the most dangerous moments in any police encounter, and the exact words that protect you from becoming a wrongful arrest statistic. Let's start with what almost nobody understands about this phrase. You match a description sounds specific, like the officer has real evidence pointing at you. In reality, it's often one of the vaguest legal standards in policing. Male, dark clothing, medium height describes an enormous percentage of any city's population at any given moment. That vagueness isn't a bug. For some officers, it's a tool, because it gives them a legal sounding reason to stop almost anyone. Here's the first mistake almost everyone makes the moment they hear this. They start defending their character. I would never do something like that. I've never even had a parking ticket. It feels natural. You're innocent, so you want to prove it immediately. But character statements aren't evidence. And worse, every word you say while defending yourself is being recorded, weighed, and potentially used to build a profile of how you react under pressure. The second mistake is agreeing to extra scrutiny to clear your name faster. Sure, you can look in my car. I have nothing to hide. This feels like the fastest way to end the encounter, but it isn't. It often extends it, because now there's something to search, and searches take time, attention, and can uncover completely unrelated issues that had nothing to do with the original description. The third mistake is getting visibly frustrated or raising your voice. This is ridiculous. I don't look anything like that. Even if you're completely right, agitation in this specific moment reads as exactly what officers are trained to watch for. Behavior consistent with someone who has something to hide. Your anger, even justified, becomes part of the narrative against you. The fourth mistake, and this is the one almost nobody catches, offering to show ID before being asked, or over-volunteering personal details to seem cooperative. Here's my ID, I work at company. I live right down the street. Every piece of unsolicited information becomes something on the record that didn't need to be there. Cooperation doesn't require oversharing. Here's exactly what you say instead and why the order of these words matters. First, officer, I understand you're doing your job, but I want to be clear. I did not match consent to any search. Calm, respectful, but firm. Then, can you tell me specifically what the description included so I understand why I've been stopped? This does something powerful. It forces the officer to articulate specifics out loud on record. Vague descriptions tend to fall apart the moment they're forced into specific language. Let's go deeper into why this approach actually works, because understanding the mechanics changes how confidently you can use it. Legally, an officer needs what's called reasonable suspicion to detain someone based on a description. Not just any description, but one specific enough to reasonably connect to the person being stopped. When you calmly ask them to state the specifics, you're not being difficult. You're testing whether that reasonable suspicion actually exists, or whether it's built on something too vague to hold up. This is also the moment where a huge percentage of wrongful stops either de-escalate immediately or continue building towards something worse. If the description truly doesn't match, different clothing color, different height range, wrong location entirely, calmly pointing out the specific mismatch without arguing about your character is far more effective than any emotional defense could ever be. The description mentioned a red jacket. I'm wearing blue. Is there additional information connecting me to this? That's not an argument. That's a fact, stated once, calmly. Now here's something almost nobody talks about, and it's important. What happens if the officer decides to proceed anyway, despite an unclear match? You do not physically resist. You do not argue further, and you do not attempt to leave. This is not the moment to win the legal argument on the street. This is the moment to survive the encounter safely and win the argument later, with documentation in a setting where it actually matters. Which brings us to something critical: documentation. The moment this kind of stop happens, especially if it feels like a case of mistaken identity, everything about it matters for later. What time it happened, exactly what the officer said the description included, whether you were detained, searched, or simply questioned and released, whether backup arrived, whether you were told you were free to go, and if so, exactly when. Here's a detail almost nobody thinks about until it's too late. Ask directly. At some point during the interaction, am I being detained or am I free to go? This single question does something legally significant. It forces clarity on your status. If the answer is you're free to go, you calmly end the interaction. If the answer is anything else, you now know you're legally being held, which changes what your rights and responses should be moving forward. And it's now clearly on record that you asked. Let's talk about a scenario that makes this even more complicated. What happens if there are multiple officers and one says one thing while another contradicts it? This happens more often than people realize. In this situation, you address whichever officer is clearly in charge of the interaction, and you repeat your same calm question. You do not get pulled into arguing with multiple people at once, because that's exactly when tension escalates unnecessarily. Now let's talk about after the stop, because what you do in the following 24 hours matters almost as much as what you did during it. Write down everything while it's fresh. Not just what was said, but the tone, the specific wording, whether you felt the stop was reasonable given the actual description, and any inconsistencies you noticed between what different officers said. If there was a witness, get their name and contact information if possible. If the stop happened somewhere with cameras, a business, a residence, a traffic camera, note the exact time and location, because footage can sometimes be requested later. Here's something that surprises people. You're often entitled to request the officer's report on the stop, especially if you believe it was based on an unreasonably vague description. This isn't about being combative. It's about creating a paper trail that either confirms the stop was reasonable or reveals a pattern if it wasn't. Let's address something people often wonder but rarely ask out loud. Does staying calm and polite mean you're somehow admitting guilt or accepting that the stop was fair? No. Compliance in the moment and disagreement with the stop's legitimacy are two completely separate things. You can fully comply with instructions, stay physically safe, and still firmly believe and later argue through proper channels that the stop itself lacked sufficient basis. These aren't contradictions. They're two different battles fought in two different arenas at two different times. There's a psychological piece to this too that rarely gets discussed. Being mistaken for someone else, especially in a tense police encounter, can feel deeply unsettling, almost like your own identity is being questioned by someone with authority over the situation. That feeling is valid. But the moment you let that feeling drive your reactions, through anger, through over-explaining, through visible panic, you shift the officer's attention away from the actual mismatch in the description and onto your behavior instead. Staying calm isn't about suppressing how you feel. It's about refusing to hand over a new reason for suspicion when the original one may not have been solid to begin with. One more layer worth understanding: repeat encounters. If you live in an area where you've been mistaken for a description more than once, that pattern itself is worth documenting and potentially raising with a local oversight body or attorney. A single vague stop might be an unfortunate coincidence. A repeated pattern starts to look like something worth formally questioning. Let's bring this all together with the exact sequence one more time, because repetition is what makes this usable under real pressure, not just understandable in a calm video. When you hear "you match a description," stay calm, don't defend your character, don't offer to prove your innocence through unnecessary cooperation, and don't get frustrated. Ask what specifically the description included. If it doesn't match, state the specific difference once. calmly. Ask clearly whether you're being detained or free to go. Comply physically, regardless of the answer, while reserving your actual objections for later through documentation and, if necessary, legal channels. This entire approach exists for one reason: to get you out of a tense, potentially dangerous moment as safely as possible, while preserving every tool you might need afterward if the stop turns out to have been unjustified. It's not about winning an argument on the street. It's about surviving the moment and having everything you need to address it properly once it's over. This video is for educational purposes only, based on general principles of US law. I'm not a licensed attorney, and this is not legal advice. For your specific situation, consult a licensed attorney in your state. Subscribe for more videos like this one, breaking down exactly what to do in situations most people never think to prepare for until they're already in them.